You're listening to the Sass Says podcast. I'm your host, Christy Rocha, also known as Sass. I identify as a woman, a wife, and a mother. That should tell you a lot already. And over the last few years, I've learned the value of talk therapy. I have seen how my inner work not only enhances my own well-being, but also my marriage, my parenting, my relationships. And in fact, you wouldn't be hearing this right now if it weren't for the work I've done. My mission is to debunk the misconceptions and stigmas around what therapy is and who it's for. Let's normalize working on our mental health and seeking help when needed. We've all heard of self-care, self-help, and self-love, but do you often wonder how to actually make it all happen? I do. You'll hear strategy-based conversations with professionals, as well as inspiring and validating stories from women who are just like you and me. Think of this podcast as the weekly therapy sessions you didn't know you needed, with a dash of sass, a lot of vulnerability, and me, relentlessly asking, but how? Hello. All right, my guest today is psychologist Dr. Quincee Gideon. She specializes in trauma recovery and post-traumatic growth in her clinical work and through education. She is particularly interested in advocating for healthy boundaries, self-discovery, and challenging our own inner shame. Over the years, Dr. Quincee developed a specialization in codependency, how trauma impacts the brain and body, cults, and religious trauma. All right, so we get into most of her specialties on today's show. Specifically, we take a look at religious trauma, cult trauma. We really do quite a bit with cults. She shares with me what constitutes a cult, one definition of what constitutes a cult, why a person would get involved with one, all the things. I mean, a lot of the questions that you have after watching some documentaries, I ask. We also talk about the documentaries. Dr. Quincee also shares her story of coming from a very religious upbringing, taking missionary trips to Africa, and all of the pieces of the puzzle that led to the work she does now with her specialization. So here she is, and as always, stay tuned after for my final thoughts. Hey, Dr. Quincee, so nice to meet you. Thank you for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've had a little bit of difficult, but we are here and we're doing this, and I'm very excited.
Sometimes the cards are just stacked against you, but we made it work.
Yes, we did. All right. So, as I mentioned, I usually like to start with getting to know you a little bit. And why did you say, hey, I think I want to be a therapist?
My journey actually started as an international missionary. So in college, I took an international trip to Zambia. There was kind of a horror story that started that. I was in a class in college called Social Problems, and my roommate and I were taking it, and we had watched the documentary that had been put out by Invisible Children.
Mm.
And so she was pre-med and I was sociology. And so we just decided, let's do that next summer. Let's go to Africa next summer.
Wow.
And so we planned everything. We were ready to go. The spring break before we left, she was tragically killed in a car wreck.
Oh my God.
And I had to kind of gather myself and decide what I was going to do. But, staying in the apartment, in the town, in sort of the college environment,
Wow.
I was kind of at my wit's end with that, because I was barely surviving from, spring break to the end of the semester. So I decided to go, and I went with an organization. It was a faith-based organization. It was a missional organization. And when I was there, I was slapped in the face with my privilege and my white savior complex, and all of the ways in which faith played out in different parts of the world, especially those that had been proselytized to.
Say that word again.
Proselytized. So like those that had had an outside influence come in and they were converted to a different faith system. So, Africa was not originally Christian.
Right.
There was a lot of tribal, indigenous religions there, and then Christians came in part of crusades and other things to convert. So I really, I think, had a moment, and I decided that that's the work that I wanted to do. So I went back to college, and then over the course of the next 10 years, I went back and forth to Africa, living there part-time in different parts of Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, Congo, South Sudan now.
Wow.
So I was kind of in that area. And every time I would go, I was confronted with trauma.
Mm.
What in the world do we do about trauma? Hugging and praying it away is not sufficient. We need something else going on here. So I decided to get my doctorate in clinical psychology, and that was at a seminary. And part of our requirements as a doctoral student there was to also get a master's in theology. So I ended up with a practice, with a kind of fervor in psychology of working with folks who had experienced a lot of trauma, but they were in either faith communities, or they had, they were on the receiving end of those faith communities trying to come in and convert them. Or they were, former child soldiers. They were living in war zones. So trauma ended up being kind of my thing, and a lot of different kinds of trauma.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Okay. So I want to go back. Being in this social problems course,
Mhm.
was that an intentional, this is something that interests me? Was this a required course that transpired into something that interests you? Yeah, go ahead. You nodded, but I don't know.
As a sociology major, we had to take the social problems class. So I was already kind of in the field. I decided to major in sociology because it translated well into social work. And I really
Got
thought
it.
that that was what I was going to do. So part of the degree requirements was to take this class. And for my roommate who was pre-med, it was just a extra that she was taking.
Okay. And I ask only because I think that I've had some conversations on the show about being in your 20s, being in college, and sort of the expectation that you're supposed to just know what you want to do with your life. And
Mhm.
I think that's a really cool example of just taking a course, right? Because it was part of a track, and it ended up working out. And I think
Mhm.
that's pretty cool. Um and then, oh gosh, yeah, the story of your roommate is tragic.
I know.
I What type of support, if any, did you receive during that time that you were grieving and processing that loss?
I think the expectation was to get busy, kind of throw myself into something. And that's exactly what I did
Mm,
when I went overseas for the summer. When I came back, that's when the feelings started coming up, obviously, because I was less distracted and not in a new culture and a new country and a new environment, and
right.
not trying to learn a new language. So when I returned, I had some really, really intense grief symptoms. And it got to the point to where I remember emailing my mom in the middle of the night and being like, I need to see someone. And she must have called our insurance that next morning, because by 9:05, I had a list of 3 people,
Yeah.
and she was really responsive in that way. My friend, the one that passed away, she and I went to high school together, and our dads coached together, and our moms were very good friends. Our brothers were the same age.
Wow.
So it rocked our community.
Yeah.
And I think it rocked my parents because they were looking at their kid, and it could have been me.
Yeah.
I could have easily been in that car with her. In fact, it was, not uncommon for us to travel back and forth together.
Right.
So it was just by sheer coincidence and luck that I wasn't in that car. And so I think the whole community was like they were following my lead, which I really appreciated. I don't know if we had really had, an experience of grief in my family or in my community like that,
Mm,
where anyone knew what to do.
yeah.
So it really was a blessing that they were able to kind of come around to me in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I ask because nothing nearly as personal, nothing nearly that hits quite deeply as I can hear now that that did for you and your whole community and family. Um, but now looking back on my college experience and remembering certain things that happened, including deaths and um, you know, actually both were deaths. Like I was in college when I don't know if you familiar with this, but Yardley Love was a lacrosse player, women's lacrosse player that was killed by her boyfriend, domestic violence,
Mm,
and it's a big One Love Foundation is a big
mhm,
community now, and they do a lot of great work. But I was in college when that happened, and I didn't know her directly, but I knew a lot of people who did, and also and my roommate who I went to high school with lost her cousin while we were in school, and there's so much between both of those situations that I look back on, and I remember being around the people who were more emotionally affected and more directly affected than I was, and really not knowing what to do, and not knowing not even knowing, I don't I couldn't tell you one thing that, like, the schools did. I couldn't
mhm,
tell you one thing, like, there's not a doubt in my mind that knowing what I know now, anyone closely related to either of those situations needed to seek some help, needed to have
mhm,
therapists, needed to have a counselor, needed to just have a mentor of some kind that I'm sure some of them did, but I know firsthand that there were some that didn't. And
mhm.
I don't know, it's just there's still something missing in our systems, in our schools, in our everything having to do with mental health. I don't know. I mean, it's like not rocket science and it's like a really broad statement, but you know,
Yeah,
things
I agree.
happen and I I don't know. I don't know. It's just wild to me that that wasn't like an immediate here.
Response.
Yeah.
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 I went to Texas A&M,
Mm,
and it's a former military school. So there's still a very strong military presence, which in some ways,
mhm.
I mean, I was certainly the black sheep there with as liberal as I am. But there's a lot of credence paid. There's a lot of ritual and ceremony
Mhm.
around those that we lost. So in fact, every April, we have in the Texas A&M community, we have what we call muster, and basically all of the names of students that have passed away, or
Wow.
even other Aggies that have passed away. Their names are read at this muster ceremony, and it's huge. It's in this like huge like coliseum, and
Wow.
everyone goes. And to this day, I like on that date. So that happened about a month. Muster happens one time a year, and it just luckily landed about a month after my friend passed away. And that was like it was such an experience to
Yeah.
hear or to see an entire stadium
Yeah.
full of people, sort of recognize her and ritualize
Mhm.
something about her passing. So that was really helpful. And I feel like, you know, what happens in schools that are not former military schools,
Right.
like what
Right.
happens in those spaces.
Right.
Like we have this huge quad area in college, and you can't walk on the grass of the memorial center, which is
Mm.
like the student center. You can't walk on the grass because that is that pays respect to all of those like fallen Aggies, which
Yeah.
is funny because on my first day of school with my friend, we were riding the bus to school and it was raining, and we had to run to a history class
Mhm.
that we were already running late for, and I tripped on the stair and knocked her down the stairs of the bus onto the grass, the sacred grass that we're not supposed to walk on. And
Yeah.
we were like scrambling freshmen
Yeah.
trying to get off that freaking grass because we knew
Yeah.
we were about to get yelled at. But that was on our first day. We showed up with mud
Oh.
everywhere.
Yeah.
And I mean, how interesting that now she's
Yes.
memorialized in that
Yeah.
very same grass.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Oh, that's nice. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I can relate to that. We had a seal on the ground that you just couldn't step on, and
mhm.
it's right in a doorway, and you gotta everybody looks like an idiot, walks like an idiot, just trying to get around this darn seal. But yeah, I'll leave it at this. I don't mean to harp on this aspect of it, but it just, neither of the kids in my experience were students at the school,
Hmm.
which makes it obviously a lot more challenging, right? Because you need the people around you, around the person who's grieving, to like notify someone who would
Mhm.
help, or the
Mhm.
person who's grieving needs to be able to notify someone who would help, right? Which makes it all the more difficult. But I don't know. I think just as a whole, there's something lacking there, because I could see, looking back, like just the impact, the ripple effect on
Mhm.
every aspect of those individuals' lives: academics, athletics,
Totally.
socialization, all of it. And I would be curious if there's something that I'm missing. If
Hmm.
someone did step up and say, "Hey, I'm noticing these grades, yada yada yada." Anyway, I don't know. It's just, now I'm getting like really down my own path and my own story here.
Hey, it's a real concern. I understand it. I lived it.
Yeah. All right. So now, okay, so moving forward, and I'm not going to skip the travel. I will go back to it, but
Okay.
I am curious about the seminary
Mhm.
for schooling. Was that on purpose?
It was a mixed bag. I mean, when you're applying to doctoral programs, you are really trying to find a good fit. And sometimes a good fit means both how they're teaching, and sometimes a good fit is where they're located in the
Okay.
country based on, relationships that you're in or whatever. So for me, the seminary ended up being a good fit because at that point I was I was a missionary. I was deeply immersed in the faith
Okay.
tradition and really trying to make sense of how a loving God could let so much suffering happen.
Okay.
And I couldn't get my mind around that. And so, in some ways, there was a draw to a seminary that had a really strong clinical psychology program separate from the seminary, operated separately, but that we also had to get theological training because I really thought that that was going to help me grapple with this really untenable space that
Got
I
it.
was having to live in every day. I
Okay.
also got married right before starting grad school, and he was a musician and a vocal coach. And so being in Los Angeles was like an easy yes for him. And at that point, I was really trying to accommodate his life and his career, given that I was about to be in grad school for 7 years.
Okay. And if you don't mind me asking, I mean, and maybe I'm just ignorant to exactly what a missionary means, but you were a practicing religious person going into
Yes.
this. Yeah.
Yes, I was. I grew up in a very fundamental Christian, evangelical Christian home. And
Okay.
that was very much a part of my identity at the time.
Okay. Okay. So now, okay. Okay. What going into this program, you're thinking, hey, maybe this will help me marry what I'm seeing, which with what I've been taught to believe and this and that. What did it actually do? What did you actually come away from that program thinking and feeling?
It was a long process, but essentially what I did in seminary is deconstruct. And that is a very specific process that happens in a religious community where someone is taking all of the faith, the traditions, the things that they took without consideration because they grew up in it or they were told that this is the way that things are. And you take all of those faiths, those traditions, those belief systems, and you try to pull them apart. You observe them, you look at them, you decide what you want to keep and what you want to leave behind.
Okay.
In the rigid religious world, deconstruction is the worst thing and that can happen,
Yeah.
because it typically leads someone to a space where there's a lot more gray space, a lot more nuance, instead of the black and white world in which we grew up knowing about. And
Mm-hmm.
there was also personal things that were going on. So I had kind of a collection of experiences. I was sitting in theology classes with the people that had written the book, like the books
Wow.
that all seminary folks study,
Mm-hmm.
on things like New Testament. And they were totally blowing my mind over things that I had just been taught by like small town uneducated pastors, to be honest,
Mm-hmm.
and had just taken, and then had taken that to a mission field and had assumed that that was the truth that needed to be spread. And I was kind of I was hearing from those professors what's actually going on in those texts, the like historical data that we have, the ways in which this doesn't quite fit, or
Yeah.
actually this is a really bad translation of the Greek or the Hebrew. And so I was kind of wide-eyed
Mm-hmm.
and sitting in classes going, oh my God, I've been lied to. I have been totally lied to. And everyone around me is a part of it. Like they've been lied to too. And so there was that knowing. I also went through a very traumatic divorce at the time. There was a lot of really complicated things that went on, but essentially I had followed all of the rules of my religion, including things like purity and chastity and accountability. And I was a faithful woman that really did everything that I could to support a husband. And when that was falling apart, I had a bit of a crisis of like, I can follow all of the rules
Mm-hmm.
and that doesn't save me from suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So why am I walking through this world in such a rigid, unforgiving way as far as like how to do things, when in the end it's not actually protecting me? I thought that following the rules was going to protect me
Right.
from something, from suffering, and in fact it doesn't.
Yeah.
So those two experiences, along with just being exposed to different people, I got into a research lab that was really curious about a lot of the work I was doing in Uganda through my nonprofit at the time. But the way that they were asking questions about trauma and impact, I think, even though it was a faith-based school, the way that they were asking really helpful research questions, I think humbled me a little bit. It helped me kind of step back and be like, gosh, I have been really, really single-minded or protected in some way from knowing about everything, that was available to me while running a nonprofit.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's journey to Africa for a minute.
Okay.
What can you give an example of what you mean when you say, smacked in the face with your privilege? Like what's something that comes to mind maybe of your time there that was like, whoa, I never thought about this way, or I don't know.
Well, literally every single element of life.
Yeah.
So, landing and immediately smelling the country, and every country in Africa has a very distinct smell based on
Wow.
the diet of the people and how close the open sewage is, and body odor and all of that stuff that I was kind of confronted with.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it's the privileged white girl driving around in a car, and not a motorcycle with like 3 goats on the back of it and 2 children, but like a car that the window's shut and the dust didn't get all like up in your nose, and just sort of observing the abject poverty. And then, that was kind of my first experience. But then when I started living there for extended periods of time, I think that my experience really changed, and it was more understanding community and understanding support, understanding how these communities were so resilient to kind of everyday needs not being met very consistently, but
Mm.
their attachment to one another, their support of one another, the way that babies are held constantly until they're about 4.
Wow.
And then they have like a good group of friends that are kind of built into their community. I just felt like there was a lot of things that were almost in direct opposition to how I had grown up.
Okay.
And that was new to me. And then I think it was something that I was constantly having to contend with in running a nonprofit and interacting with staff members and trying to ask myself questions like, okay, am I trying to westernize them, or
Mm.
do I have access to something that they maybe didn't have access to as far as education, and this is something that I really need to push for. There was constant questions around that, and I think that's healthy. I think anyone that's working in a space that they did not grow up in and they don't identify as really needs to be asking those questions a lot.
Yeah. Okay. So, given the experience that you just described of what life was like, not so much for you, but for the communities and what you had to kind of learn about and immerse yourself in, and now you're here in the US living, a completely different type of life. Have you taken anything from that experience and implement it into your life here? Like, and I'm getting at the aspect of, just your example of the community and the resilience and how babies are held. Like,
Mhm.
what aspects of your life there have you taken back home with you? I guess is really what I'm asking.
I think in a couple of different ways. I embody what Africa did to me.
Hmm.
But I think the first is recognition of privilege and the ways in which I was the owner of privilege no matter where I traveled
Mm.
in Africa and then back here in the States,
Hmm.
as a white presenting woman that was articulate and able to speak the language really well. I got more than
Right.
other people, and I hold that a lot, especially in my current family and my stepchildren, and talking and trying to help them understand that their life in Los Angeles in Orange County is not always going to be a reflection of how the rest of the world works. And so we're constantly having conversations around privilege and owners of privilege.
Hmm.
There was really obstinate gender roles in Africa that constantly made me uncomfortable and created a lot of gender-based violence in those communities.
Mm.
And in some ways, I still get kind of triggered around seemingly narcissistic controlling men. I
Yeah.
have absolutely no tolerance for that,
Yeah.
mostly because I was constantly having to contend with some version of that in order to have any level of success
Right.
in bargaining with the government and trying to figure out how we could make a program and all of that good stuff. So it's been a mixed bag. I felt for years I had a lot of guilt around just the like level or the amount of things that we accumulate
Hmm.
as Americans. And
Don't
I
don't look behind me.
no, no, I think you'll like the point I'm going to make, but
Okay.
I really had to, in some ways, deconstruct that, because that was a very, um, embedded, internalized thing from my childhood, from my religion, that
Mm.
essentially said, like, your riches are in heaven and not on earth.
Ah.
And it was, I mean, there was some finger wagging and there was some sneers and there was judgment for folks who wanted things that were nice, or carried a certain bag to church, or wanted to be fashionable,
Mhm.
when really that was not something that my church had value in. And so I took that and then I applied that old belief system, and I applied it to my experience in Africa. And Africa, in some ways, like confirmed it for me, right? Like, we don't need very much. We can get by without a lot. But to be honest, the thing that puts my brain on ice after a long day of treating trauma is painting a room,
Mhm.
decorating a space, going to a vintage flea market and finding the perfect piece of furniture that I get to refinish.
Mhm.
So I've had to reclaim some things that, in
Mhm.
some ways, Africa, or my experience on the continent really affirmed unhealthy things in me. I also learned how to survive.
Yeah.
I can live for weeks without plumbing and electricity. I can start a fire. I can make a whole chicken from scratch on a campfire. I have, I just felt like I learned so much about surviving and advocating for myself and deciding what was most helpful. So when I was living out in the villages, I had a hut out in the village, and I was getting by okay, but the village did not have any sort of latrine
Mm,
or bathroom, and so there was no flushing. Like, flushing was not going to happen.
right.
But I decided that it was in my best interest, in for my mental health, that I was going to spend some money on having a latrine built,
Mhm.
and that, like, to advocate for that, to negotiate that, to pay workers, to
Yeah.
figure out what I needed, like, all of those things I think are lessons that I
Wow.
continue, to take with me.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. So coming home, what what happened then to what happened with the relationships in your life that were from the previous life, or like from the thought pattern that you're now trying to deconstruct?
Mhm.
What happened then, and where are you now with those relationships?
I mean, I think relationships were challenged in that way, but I would also say that my family was really supportive in the traumatic nature of my divorce, and I think that caused some questions for them too.
Okay.
They are in no way deconstructed. They, like, my whole family, I think, would still very much closely identify with the church that they raised us in.
Mhm.
But I think um maybe some of it is personality and, like, who they knew me to be my whole life.
Mm.
Like, you know, not none of my mom's friends had a daughter that was living in a hut in
Right.
Africa and could only call
Right.
every 3 months.
Right.
Like,
Right.
no one
Yeah.
had to stand on a
Yeah.
termite hill.
Yeah.
And so there was already, like, a little, built-in um, leniency or
Fair.
understanding that
Yeah.
they were kind of working with someone different
Mhm.
than what they had expected in life. And so I think now we have close relationships, and I don't need them to believe what I believe, and they would love for me to believe what they believe, and
Right.
that's something that we can tolerate
Yeah.
together.
Cool. Okay. Cool. Okay. So, and thank you. I put you on the
Yeah.
hot seat for a while there. Going more towards the like generalized, public listening. Can you give us what your working definition of trauma is?
It changes,
Mhm.
but right now, my definition of trauma is something that happens too much, too fast, and too often, or too often. So that there's either a chronic nature of needs not being met, or a nervous system being overloaded.
Mhm.
But essentially, it's a moment in time that changes how you perceive yourself or the world around you. And that's for those one time traumas. And for the complex, complicated, ongoing nature of trauma, it's those events that warp the way that you see your sense of safety in the world.
Okay. All right. And you do center your work mainly around religious and cult trauma.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
my thing.
that's your meat and potatoes. Okay. So what give okay, as someone who has no frame of reference personally for this type of trauma, what are the main I don't know, it's hard to ask questions like this, right? Because there's probably different for everybody, but what are some common like pain points and like moments of like, what am I doing here? How did I get here?
In religious trauma, like,
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I
I
can
want
imagine okay, let me give you one example of what I'm thinking, and then
okay.
you can better answer the question that was not
Okay.
very clear.
Go
Like, as
ahead.
you were talking, I
Mhm.
heard, whoa, identity crisis.
Yeah,
Like, I thought life was one way, and this is how I fit into that life, and now someone else is like, "Whoa, life doesn't have to be that way, and you don't have to fit in." Are there other aspects of religious trauma that we might not think about, or other than identity crisis?
totally. There's a lot of different ways that religious trauma or, spiritual abuse can play out. So there can be trauma that happens within the church or religious environment. So with the leaders, with the belief system, with the community, and the ways in which, someone is treated in those spaces. And that can range anywhere between, sexual abuse to ongoing emotional manipulation and coercion,
Mm,
right? So like there's a big range there.
okay.
There can also be trauma that happens because of, not within necessarily the
Ah,
religious, but because of the religious beliefs. So
mhm.
if you have a, strong purity culture and something happens outside of that of the church, so it could be just a horrifying trauma that happens to a lot of people, such as something like sexual assault,
Mhm.
but it happened outside of the church environment. But because of your beliefs about how that ruins you,
Mm,
you won't be lovable, what God thinks about you, whether you feel safe to talk about that, to report that. So now we've added an extra layer on top of an already traumatic event
yeah.
because of the religious beliefs. And then there can be the deep indoctrination that happens for people, whether you're born into that or you come into the faith system, later in life. And that indoctrination and then the wake up, the moment
Mhm.
that you realize that you have been emotionally coerced into a belief system that wouldn't let you out
Mm,
because you weren't allowed to ask questions and you weren't allowed to challenge anything, not in a real way.
yeah.
That can be very traumatizing too. Just the lost time, the lost relationships, the delayed emotional development, the delayed relational development, all kinds of loss can happen in that
Yeah.
space.
As you were talking, I was imagining how I'm sure for some it's also feeling like like trying to put myself in those shoes. Like I feel like I would also be questioning, like, why didn't I see it? Why didn't I do, like, the self blame and
Mhm.
the shame and guilt and all those really fun words that
Mhm.
show up when we're in
Mhm.
trauma.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
just imagine what someone is taught around hell and losing God's favor. And if something happens that they don't understand is trauma and something that happened to them and not because of
Right.
them, but they think that they've lost eternal favor with God. They think that they're, ruined and going to hell. That's
Mhm.
traumatic. That
Yeah.
adds insult to injury.
Yeah. Okay, so anyone with a streaming account has seen, at least I'm sure one to multiple documentaries on all different types of cults, levels of cults, types of cults, all the things. A, I want to know what you think about documentaries going out there about cults and things. And then B, one of the, I think regardless of the type, at least me, I'm always wondering, you know, why get into it? Like, why even go to the meeting? So if you could touch a little bit on what the mindset could be of a person even finding themselves in the situation where they're entering a cult or religious cult or any kind of cult that they're not born into, or a parent says do this.
The four main vulnerability factors for joining a cult are
Much more eloquently said.
uh, middle class,
Okay.
intelligent, not gullible, intelligent, wanting a better world and wanting a community that's focused on that, and having gone through something recently upsetting that really shifts your path in life.
Okay.
So, if any of those four things have happened to you or are you yesterday, you're vulnerable to joining a cult.
Wow.
So because it's nothing that they don't come at you with their crazy.
Right.
They come at you with 95% of something that just feels right. And it might be,
Right.
some of it is like anti-racist, anti-homophobic. We can build a better world. This is how we have to do it. You're with your people here, right? All that sounds really good. That's something I would join.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's going to be 5% of something just like a little bit off, but you're not going to catch it because 95% of it is good. And you'll tell yourself, no community is going to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And no big deal. I'll leave the stuff that doesn't feel great and I'll keep everything that does. But then it's like, hey, we could use your time and your resources because we really have this mission and we really need some help with this. And so now you're spending more time and resources, but the amount of correct information that you're getting is lessening. So that 95% of good ethos, good ethical behavior, rational ideas, that's decreasing very slowly over time. So maybe you're a couple of months in, you're spending a lot of time with this group. Everyone's pretty lovely. You've gotten more support here than you've ever gotten anywhere in your life. There's a mission that you really believe in. And you came into this feeling like you actually chose, yes, I want to be involved in this.
Right.
And now you're a couple months in, and now 50% or 40% or 30% of the information that you're getting is logical, true, based in reality. And now you're being exposed to more and more. And there's always some connection to the mission. We believe this, and therefore that's why this is true. That's why this mission is important. Or this is our overall mission, and that proves our belief system in some way. And then that becomes a really circular type of reasoning, right? No new information can come into it, because if you have issues with it, if you have hesitations with it, now there's a growing threat that you're going to lose your entire community if you speak up too much, right? They're going to kick you out because they all believe in everything that's being said, or at least they're not saying that they don't.
Yeah.
Right. So now there's a bigger threat. Maybe sometimes there's like a sunk cost fallacy that goes on where you're like, well, I've dedicated this much, or sometimes it's like, but I've given them $50,000 for this, building that they're going to actually turn a profit on. So now I have to stay. There's lots of ways that folks get sucked into these things.
Yeah. I feel like the points that you mentioned of the vulnerabilities, susceptibilities, and factors, I hear that and I think, wow, what I think like a cultural misconception we have.
Big time.
And I feel like sometimes the way that people are portrayed on those documentaries is what perpetuates that misconception. Are there other misconceptions about either someone who's in a cult joining a cult, or potentially misconceptions about what it's like to leave one? Anything else come to mind that you think is misunderstood in like culture about all of this?
There's lots of misconceptions. My goodness, we would be here all day. But I think I actually really like documentaries. And the reason that I like them is because they're trying to show you how the world sees these cults, while also trying to get a story, and really putting a microphone in front of survivors.
Okay.
And survivors that have not ever been able to speak and be validated in their experience, right? They've usually been pretty ostracized. So I really actually like documentaries. I like that you can see that a documentary made 3 years ago is going to have a different intonation than one that's made yesterday, because we are growing in our knowledge around this sort of phenomenon.
Interesting.
But I really do, if anyone has had the experience of like gullible weirdos or who join cults, go back, because actually you'll see doctors and attorneys, and you'll see like intellectuals, you'll see psychologists, therapists are super vulnerable, right? Because we live in a liminal space in therapy, right? We're constantly holding gray space. And so we have a really high tolerance to that. So you go into a group and they say something that's like really kind of sideways, and you're like, I've heard worse in
Well,
therapy.
yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, right? Like
Yeah.
we can really tolerate a lot of that. And so I think that there's, there's lots of misconceptions. Another vulnerability, it's two-sided. One vulnerability is being non-religious and unchurched in any way,
Mm,
and having a passion to change the world that typically leaves kids and teens and young adults, especially when they go to college. It's a high level of, vulnerable time, but it'll leave them longing for something that they feel like was denied them, right? So
mm,
there's got to be some spiritual practice, because the other end of the spectrum in vulnerability is growing up in a very rigid religion,
hmm.
and that makes sense to them,
Right.
and weird belief systems
Right.
track with
Right.
them. It's easier for
Right.
them to tolerate, and so they're also really vulnerable to some of these doomsday cults, those cults that have like they end up having a strange kind of outcome or belief system.
Okay. Are there mm, are there, I don't know, like on like today out there in the world, are there mass amounts of cults that we just don't know about?
Yeah, I mean, my practice is in Santa Monica, and there's several active cults there, and
Mm.
they range from spiritual cults to yoga cults. We've got our eye on about three
Wow.
different yoga groups that are very, very culty and very abusive.
Uh-huh.
It can be a religious offshoot. It can be Scientology. There's lots of different kind of cultic groups operating, and that's just in a small little sector of Los Angeles.
Yeah. Okay, so that prompts another question. What actually constitutes a cult?
People define it in different ways. And this is actually something that we're talking a lot about, especially in research, because you can't research something that's not measurable or doesn't have a
Oh,
good definition. So
right.
it's changing. But in general, cults are groups that use coercive control to
Okay.
keep people inside the group, give them very little access to change. And there's usually some higher purpose for that, like financial. There's, attention mongering
Mm,
from leaders. There can be lots of reasons that a cult exists, but overall, we're kind of looking at, can people come and go freely?
okay.
Are they able to maintain their autonomy? What are they being indoctrinated with that prevents them from feeling safe with people outside of the group? I mean, we're
Interesting.
we're
Yeah.
asking all of those questions.
Okay. Okay. And you mentioned deconstructing. Are
Mhm.
there other I don't know, what's the word? Modalities, strategies for someone is having the moment of, whoa, I was here and I need to get out, or I'm out now and I need to heal. What does that look like? How else would you go about that with a client or even for yourself?
Deconstruction is just a general term that we kind of blanket over an
Okay.
ongoing, slow process. And that process is going to look different for people. Some people are going to stay in a space of asking questions for a lot longer because they're not ready to accept new answers, right?
Hmm.
Some people are going to move through part of their deconstruction or their healing process by wanting to reform the group that they were a part of, which means that inevitably they remain part of that group for longer,
Mm,
which can be
interesting.
complicated.
Hmm.
So there's lots of paths to this. My primary suggestion for anyone that has experienced any sort of cultic abuse or religious trauma is to find a trauma specialist that knows what the hell happens in these really upsetting, like your whole life just changed the moment that you left. You lost
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
You need to find someone that kind of knows
Yeah.
that what happens there and how to help.
Okay. Okay. And I know of you from Instagram, and I'm curious now, given the sensitivity of this subject, how is it being a public figure on social media talking about these things? Like, what do you deal with?
It's
out there.
horrible. I hate
Yeah.
it.
I can
There's
imagine.
yeah, there's no one meaner on the internet than good Christian husbands.
Yeah.
They're in my DMs. It's threatening. There's typically some, belittling that's happening. And it's hard out there. But you know what? This is why the church doesn't change, because those that are trying to speak out, I have no qualms with anyone's belief systems. I really don't. I just don't want people to be hurt. And if
Right.
I'm pointing out that someone's hurt and your immediate response is not like, my God, thanks for letting me know.
Right. Right.
Church, we got to fix this. Like, what are we
Right.
going to do? What's the first step? If your response is, that doesn't happen, you're crazy, you have some like evil spiritual influence going on. If those are your responses, then you are not hearing what's happening in these environments, and that's why it's not changing.
Yeah.
So, for me, I want to take a holistic approach. I want to point out the traumas that happen in these spaces. I want to point out how leadership in these churches, religions, cult groups totally blow it so much of the time. I want to point out how they're missing it, right? When
Right.
they have opportunities to change something, and what I think they could do, right? That might be healthier or move us in the right direction. I also want to talk a little bit about, the personal experiences that I've had
Right.
growing up, and the ways in which, you go to this really fundamental Christian church camp for your entire life. And, there was some weird things that happened, but you don't have language for that. And you think, overall, I learned how to like hike and rock climb and do some really cool things. And then now that camp is, under investigation from the government because of
Wow.
the rampant sexual abuse that goes on. So like, I have a personal connection to that camp. I should probably be talking about that because religious trauma survivors are from there, right? So
Yeah.
I'm trying to take it on from a lot of different directions.
Yeah.
And survivors are in my DMs going, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
said, but I can't identify myself because I'm still a part of these groups, or these people will come after me too. And the comments, specifically on TikTok, are typically pretty egregious.
Yeah.
And
I can
that's just the
imagine.
way that it is. You just have to have like, I just don't look at comments anymore. That's
Yeah.
fine. I'll just keep posting my videos.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're laughing, but it's easier said than done. I know that because, it's relentless what people will do on the internet. But, um, you know, in sharing what you think could be different and leaders and everything you just said, it occurs to me that you do that because you believe some of them want to do things differently. Is that accurate?
I think that there's survivors that are in these environments right now, and they don't know that there's a different world outside that's ready, where our arms are open. We're ready
Yeah.
for you. You just come on this side and we'll take care of you. And then I think that there are people that are inside of these organizations that I really love and trust, and they feel really alone in trying to change some of these organizations because
That you
they
know and
can't.
trust, you're saying.
Totally, totally.
Okay. Okay.
And so I feel like if we can call it out, if we can look at it from different perspectives, if we can have conversations about it, then my friends and family that are in these spaces that would like to change some things are a little less lonely. And maybe that's what they start talking about at Bible study,
Yeah.
instead
Wow,
of
that's
why
awesome.
God might hate them and send them to hell.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. No, that's amazing perspective to have and to hear. It's funny, this is one of those things that maybe we edit out because I just heard it today and I'm putting you on the spot. But um have you heard of there's a podcast called Sounds Like a Cult?
Oh, yeah. I like Amanda Montell.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just heard one episode for the first time today, and it was on Instagram therapists.
Yeah.
And that
It's
was
culty.
okay. So that was
Hmm.
really interesting is the word I'm gonna use. Like,
Specifically Instagram therapists that are new agey and deny the um, correctness of research and they're very libertarian and
okay.
don't take advantage or don't pay attention to the way that you impact people. You are one person, you are a boundaried person. Everyone else that has feelings about anything else that you do, that is on them. And that's very culty.
Yeah. I was like, oh, I'm gonna have to take a finer tooth comb through my feed,
Mhm.
and it
Mhm.
makes you think. I just was really, whoa, okay. So not as touchy as I thought it was gonna be because you've heard it and you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I know that there are hours more worth of information here on what you do, but based on what we have talked about, is there any thought, idea, word of wisdom that's lingering in your heart, mind, soul, anything that you're like, I don't want to end this without saying this one thing or anything you want to leave people with?
It's kind of a two-part. I'll go back to the earlier conversation that we had around documentaries. The
Mhm.
reason that I encourage people to watch documentaries is because the more you're exposed to some of these groups and the more that you kind of have a working knowledge of it, the more critical or appropriate suspicion
Mm,
you'll have when anyone is approaching you or you're approaching a new group.
mhm.
So I think that that's a really healthy perspective to have, is one of a little bit of cynicism, not terribly, but a
Okay.
little bit of doubt and and skepticism. We want people to be asking really great questions before you get into a group. You should always be able to leave a group, no matter what, you should be able to leave. And I think that if we could kind of expand our knowledge of that, I really do think, and emotional manipulation, I want everyone to know what that looks like.
Okay.
If we could really understand healthy skepticism and emotional manipulation, I really think that we would create some inoculation against folks getting sucked into these groups. And
Okay.
that's my goal overall.
Okay. Okay. And to interact with you, I mean your social media feed is gorgeous
Oh,
and
thank you.
but I just look at it and I just look at it and see the detail. I mean,
Mm.
all the reels, all the covers of the reel, like they're just it's phenomenal.
Thank
So
you.
I
Thank you.
encourage the listeners to check out your Instagram page. Are there other ways of working with you, getting in touch with you outside of Instagram that you would want to
Sure.
mention?
Sure. So I'm also on TikTok, Dr. Quincy. It's the same handle. I'll also mention that I have two separate memberships. I have one for cult survivors and religious trauma survivors,
Okay.
where basically I walk you through all this was just a snippet. I'll take each of these little concepts like healthy skepticism and narcissistic leadership and thought reform and deconstruction. And each month I teach you something different. And my
Mhm.
hope is that it creates an ability to access information when you're not quite ready to be a part of a group yet,
Okay.
right? If you're not
Yeah.
quite ready to process that. The
Smart.
other membership I have is for therapists wanting to learn how to treat religious trauma.
Awesome.
And that is selfishly motivated because I get so many requests from all 50 states of people that want religious trauma specialists, and
Mm,
I just have a hard time finding people that know what to do and how to hold some of these spaces. So part of it is like, here, come, I'll teach you whatever I know and you teach me what you know.
right.
And also we'll create a little bit of a network here so that we know who to send people to, that they're in good hands. So if therapists are interested in learning how to treat religious trauma or cult abuse, they can join us there. And that involves a consultation group, which is like the highlight of my month,
Cool.
where we get to come together and talk. So
Yeah. I'm not a therapist, but I want to do it. I'm the worst. Like I would be in everybody's mastermind. I don't care what you're talking about. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But
That's
mostly
great.
anything therapeutic. I'm like, oh, okay. I think I should just know that. Why not?
Yeah,
Anyway, all right. Well, Dr. Quincy, thank you so much. I learned so much and your story is incredible. Thank you for being here and sharing.
it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me. It was an honor.
Fascinating stuff, right? And honestly, as soon as I say that, I have to pause because although it is fascinating, and I think it's okay that it's fascinating, it is also real life. It's someone's real life. We so often hear about cults and religious trauma after the fact, but I do think it is so important to remember that people are being victimized every day. I appreciate Dr. Quincee reminding us of that and also clearing up the major misconceptions about who and what makes a person vulnerable to a cult. I think if you did not take note, perhaps go back and have another listen as to what she shared we could all be on the lookout for and be a little bit more educated about when it comes to being susceptible or organizations or, what someone's going through. And my goodness, how about learning about what it was like for her to be in Africa? I'm trying to imagine myself having to negotiate for a latrine. And it's funny because now I'm pausing again and I hear myself and I hear how everyday kind of casual vernacular can be harmful. I basically said, can you imagine? And it's like, yeah, there are people who can. It's real life. And I guess this is my privilege showing its head. Anyway, clearly so much more to learn on this subject. So I thank you again, Dr. Quincee, for making this your mission in life. It is much needed. I mentioned it on the show and I'll mention it again. Her Instagram, website, all really, really great resources. So please check them out. I also thank you, Dr. Quincee, for sharing your story, including the story of her roommate's tragic death. I know it's not always easy to come on and share painful experiences, but I appreciate you and the other guests on my show who do, because you help make someone listening feel seen and you empower us all with more knowledge. Oh, I don't know. I just want to know so much more about this. And so I'm about to go to her Instagram and learn a little bit more. Anyway, all right. That's all I got. Thank you for listening. Thank you again, Dr. Quincee. And I will see you next time. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Sass Says is a production of Luann Nigara, Inc. This podcast is meant to be educational and not meant to replace professional therapy or professional medical attention. To learn more about today's show and what's new in my world, head over to sasssays.com. Thanks so much. Talk later.